That was perfectly timed, wasn't it? All right. So, welcome everybody. Today is Wednesday, April 21st in the year 2021. This is the Get Smarter and Make Stuff podcast. And today I am really, really pleased to welcome on to the show my good friend of a very long time, my coworker, currently my boss, actually, but somebody I've worked with and been friends with for 20 years now. Talking, of course, about Tim Ewald. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Hey, it's good to be here, Craig. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. I mean, so the name of the show is Get Smarter and Make Stuff. And as I've told you, there's really only three questions. What are you building? What are you learning? And then we have a question at the very end where we ask the guest to give us a piece of advice. So only three questions. But those three questions, I'm so fortunate that I know so many people that have a lot of intelligent things to say about those. And you are certainly very, very high up on the list, hence your presence here on the show in its early days. I had been sort of kicking around, different ways to ask these questions, and I wonder if you'll indulge me in an experiment and allow me to set the order of the questions this time around.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool. So then I'm going to start with the first question, which on this show will be, what are you building? What are you making, Tim?
So I at the moment I'm making three things. One of them is a company, which I'm not going to talk about. We talk about enough of that at work.
All right. Okay.
I'm doing two things woodworking wise, which is my main source of making stuff outside of my day job. It's interesting because they're really kind of they seem sort of diametrically opposed to one another. So I started woodworking 12 or more years ago, and pretty early on I just fell down the rabbit hole of working with hand tools. So I build furniture primarily. I do use a couple power tools, most notably a bandsaw and more recently a planer, but the bulk of my work I do with hand saws and hand planes and chisels. And it's been a really interesting path for me. Like I just I don't I don't know why. I don't know if this is maybe the engineer in me. I don't know. I wanted, when I set out to teach myself to woodwork, I felt compelled to have a rationale, like a for why I made the choices I made, and a system. And I basically decided that I would build furniture using classical joinery, and I would teach myself to do that work by hand. And over the last 10 or 12 years, I built, I don't know, maybe 15 pieces of, or 18 pieces, I don't know, some number of things, right? Some big, some small. When I say it like that, it doesn't seem like a lot. It's not it's not a lot of productivity, but
I don't know. That seems like a lot to me as a person who knows that every one of those is weeks, if not months of work, of spare time work anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely, right. It's a challenge just trying to find the time to fit it in. And then when you work by hand, there's no doubt that, that it's slower. But it also has a lot to recommend it. It's, it's more peaceful, and, sort of philosophical and therapeutic for me. Anyway, so I, kind of reached the point where I felt like I had mastered, or at least I was no longer intimidated by the kind of core joinery that I do in building a thing. And I sort of wanted to take another step and kind of give myself another challenge. And I decided that I wanted to start doing more work that involved curves. I read somewhere at one point that, shaker furniture is really popular partly because it's really easy to make with a table saw, right? It's very straightforward to make. And it's an interesting point, right? And I thought to myself, well, okay, like I'm doing well on that front, and I want to kind of up my game, as I said. And so I laid out a couple of projects, sort of culminating in wanting to build a bow front chest on chest, which is just a style of bureau or dresser. I have a chest on chest that was my grandparents' that I'm tremendously fond of, and so it's sort of inspired by that piece. But one of the things I realized was if I did that and I'm working by hand, I was going to need to be able to make the decorative moldings for that, and cut them by hand, which basically means carving them, not carving in the sense of leaves or egg and dart or anything like that, but just carving the basic shape. And I thought it would be wise to um, do a smaller project to learn more about doing that before
Hmm.
I took on that bigger project. And so I decided I would build a mirror with an elliptical top. So I've been focused on um, the initial stages of that project. So, getting the design down, working out the exact dimensions and laying out the ellipse and all that. And then I've also been spending time essentially making a sample piece, right? Cutting a curve out of a piece of cherry and a curved inch square piece of rough stock, basically. And then going through the process of cutting a decorative cove into it, and a rabbet into the back of it around the curve by hand.
Hmm.
Um, so that test piece came out all right. I was comfortable with the techniques. Um, I was basing the work on one of the articles by Charles Hayward that's collected in the Hayward books from Lost Art Press, which are a great source of information for people who want to work by hand. Um,
Yeah.
and so I used the technique that he described for cutting a curved rabbet, and it all went really well. Um, so I in the last couple days I'm very close to sort of actually moving into production mode to make this mirror for real, having done that test and having worked out the design. So that's kind of literally what's on my workbench at the moment.
Hmm. And then is that typical for you? Like, have you made it a habit to produce test pieces or do prototypes or whatever when you're working?
Um, it's it's not that common. It usually is only when I'm trying something new, something for the first time. So I actually have in the corner of my shop, like some of my original dovetail joints, like my test, like when I was teaching myself to cut dovetails. And I have a draw board mortise and tenon joint that's just off cut, right? These things are maybe like a 4-inch cube that is the joint,
Sure.
right?
Right. Yeah.
Um, and then similarly for this work, just trying out what it was going to take to carve this cove and to make the rabbit. It's all doing that kind of work on a curve piece is brand new to me. So yeah, in that case, I might make a test. Um, but that's typically the only time. Like I don't usually do that. I can't think of a place where I did that for like testing out the design of something, like a prototype in that sense, to see how I felt about the design. It's more about technique, and giving myself a chance to practice and learn some.
Yeah, and you and I, so you spoke about design a little bit. You and I actually are fairly different when it comes to design. We talk about woodworking a lot, so this is the approximately 9,387th conversation we've had about working and hand tools and the philosophy and the technique and practice and all that. But you and I have somewhat different approaches when it comes to design. In particular, tend to rely quite heavily on computer aided design. I'll do a lot of my woodworking designs or other things now, actually, now that I'm working on other materials more, using Fusion 360 and before that Google SketchUp. But you haven't really gone that route. You tend to work on paper and pencil, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of that has to do with courses I took. Well, I mean, a specific course I took. Right, I when I was in high school, I took drafting in preparation for college, where I originally went to study architecture. Um, and so and then I spent a year and a half in college in the architecture program, and so I've done a lot of technical drawing
Hmm.
with a T-square and triangles and compasses and all that, and I'm very comfortable working that way, and I'm reasonably quick at it. Um, that said, for most of the furniture that I have built, I don't come anywhere close to that. I've started doing that more recently, um, for a couple projects, I built a timber frame loft that was installed in a bedroom at a friend's house. And I realized in doing that piece, it's unusual for me to do work like that that has to fit in an exact space, and I needed a drawing that I could take measurements off of. So that kind of got me. That's the first time in a long time I really felt like I needed to break out my drafting board and actually make an accurate plan. And then this mirror project as well, because of the curve and needing to do the layout for that, I decided to make a full size template, and drawing it out was the best way to do that. But a lot of my stuff, I have a journal that I just will draw sketches in of what I want a piece to look like, and usually if there's any tricky joinery or something I'm trying to figure out, there'll be a couple pages in there with different approaches to how to do the joinery. But a lot of those things, it's more about just getting a sense of the overall shape of the thing, and I kind of keep the joinery details in my head, and in some cases work it out as I go along. When I set out to work by hand, and decided that, hey, I'm going to start by working with the traditional joints, right? Dovetails, mortise and tenons, and grooves, rabbets and dados. And so it actually, with that set of tools in hand, I mean, for most things, it's pretty straightforward to just like, I don't need a detail that says, or I don't need a plan that says, I'm going to put a dado into the side of this case piece to put a shelf here. I just know there's going to be a shelf here, and like, that's how you do it, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
So I just keep those things in mind.
So it's interesting. You've mentioned a couple times now working by hand, and I've mentioned it as well, and it's a thing that we're both interested in. Is, I mean, I would say using hand tools, not so much being a hand tool person. Like, hand tools for us aren't really the end. But so what I'm trying to come around to here is, you gave a talk that actually started me on my hand tool journey. This was actually at a programming conference. It was at the Closure Conj. But I've always told people that they should watch it, even if they don't know anything about programming, because it's just a really, really interesting philosophical commentary on what effect tools have on your thinking. Obviously, you're making a point about the programming language that we both like, Closure, but I think along the way you have a lot of interesting things to say about hand tools and really about tooling in general. So without trying to recap your entire talk, first of all, I will drop a link to that in the show notes, so people can and definitely should go watch that. It is one of the best conference talks I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot by
Well, thanks.
quite
I
good
appreciate
people.
that.
It's totally true. What's funny actually is, it would have been at a conference that featured many very, very good talks. It would have been head and shoulders above all the rest, even still, except for the fact that Russ Olson gave his moon talk,
Yeah,
which is
fantastic.
also right. It's like also one of the best ever. So this conference was just like jackpot, and I'll put a link in for that one as well. And that's definitely another one that you don't need to know a thing about programming to understand or enjoy that talk. Anyway, so to bring the question back to you, I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit, and particularly, kind of go into your theory about the interrelationship between tools and the worker and the work produced, if that's a fair summary.
Yeah, I mean, the key point of the talk is that when you make a choice about the tools that you use, the nature of the tools, is going to favor working certain ways, and that it's easy then to sort of lock yourself into that way of working. One of the things I think is really interesting about hand tools, people, it's trying to think of the right phrase to use here, but in a sense, it really is about tools that don't have limits, right? When you use power tools, big machines, they have a capacity. How wide is that joiner? How wide a piece can you rip on that table saw? If you have a CNC router, how big a piece can you process with it? And so, there are sort of inherent limitations to machines. I mean, obviously, you can have really enormous machines potentially. They take up a lot of room and they cost a lot of money and what have you. hand tools are the opposite, right? You're not bringing the piece of material to the tool. Although I guess with CNC you're not either, but that's beside the point.
Sure.
You can use the tools to really achieve whatever you want. And I think it's interesting. I have a couple nephews who are contractors, and it's the nature of their business. Like I'm a hobbyist, right? I can take my sweet time. They want to do really good work, but they also have to make a living, right? And
Yeah.
so they heavily favor using power tools for their work, as one would expect. But it's interesting because I think there are projects that are daunting to them that I think are really straightforward, right? By virtue of like, oh, you need to cut that odd shape. We could do that with a bow saw, and then we could use some gouges and a chisel to clean it up, or what have you, right?
Hmm.
And for them, it tends to be like, oh, I'm going to need to get a bigger bandsaw to be able to do this, or
A shaper or whatever.
shaper or
Yeah.
some other thing, right? The flip side, of course, is they couldn't certainly work the way that I work and survive in their field.
Right.
And it's interesting. This I will say, while I was working on this frame, what the prototype for this mirror, the point was really driven home to me because one thing that's interesting with hand tools is like we think about hand planes, and hand planes are great when you're doing something that's straight. But boy, as soon as you go to curves, you either need to make a very special hand plane, or you need to break out a chisel and a gouge and do it that way.
Mm.
Um, and it is time consuming, right? Again, I talk of this as as carving, this molding, but it's again, it's not carving as in decorative seashells or that kind of carving. It's just I need a curve cut around a curve. And it's funny because working on that piece, it really brought home to me that, like, boy, if I had a router table where I could run this curved piece around a router, a cove bit in a router, um, I would be done far, far faster.
Hmm.
And I think basically what I started to see is that where I think that hand tools are not as fast as machines for straight work, it's even more so for curved things.
Mm.
Because a lot of the hand tools that you're used to using are not optimized for that, and you have to go back to sort of more basic tools. But again, that flip side, right, is you have freedom to make whatever you want to make, right? So any shape, any size. Uh, an interesting example I just mentioned, using a router table to put a cove or a rabbet into a curved piece. But what if you need that cove to be turning in 2 dimensions, not just in one? So think of like a gooseneck molding on a dresser or something like that. Anything as soon as you get 2 dimensions of curve, a powered router is not going to help you.
Sure.
Well, I shouldn't say
A
that. I
CNC
don't
one
know,
would,
right?
but
Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
right. I
you're
mean,
5-axis at that point, and it's
yeah,
like, yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
There might be equipment. I'm sure there is equipment that would do it. It's not a thing that's easily to hand for most people.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't think this is really at all contradicts your point. I will say it's utterly fascinating to me that CNC machinery is dropping in price. I have in my shop it's a low end CNC in terms of capabilities, because the big one when you're machining is rigidity, right? CNC routers, particularly for hard materials like metals, need to be very rigid, and that's extremely difficult to achieve without throwing a giant pile of cast iron at it. But I have this thing. It's called the MP CNC, which stands for mostly printed CNC. And it's 3D printed parts and conduit, like galvanized steel conduit you pick up at Home Depot for $20, and a microcontroller and some motors, and like, it's a really capable sign carving machine. If you're just chewing up MDF and you don't care how fast you go, and you could convert it into a 4-axis or 5-axis CNC machine, and you're only out at that point. I mean, if you really, really like do all the work you possibly can yourself, you could probably get her done for a couple $100. I mean, certainly not much for what you get. Actually, I said 5-axis. I'm not totally sure that would be easy to do, but nonetheless, right, you're talking about easily 4-axis and certainly 3-axis CNC for very little money. Yes, you're compromising on rigidity and therefore on capabilities, but I don't know. It's just really interesting to me that when things get 10 times or 100 times cheaper than they used to be, then it really can be a game changer. For instance, I could imagine at some point if I wanted to do one of those 3D moldings that you're talking about, I might rough it out on my CNC router. It's not rigid enough to do millimetric precision on complex parts, but if it get me close and I can go the rest of the way with a rasp or files or whatever. I think actually one of the projects in particular I've been thinking about is guitars, right? That neck, making a neck. You can certainly do that by hand. It's not even super hard to do by hand, but you could also rough it out quite straightforwardly using a CNC and then sand your way down or, rasp your way down to a line. And that kind of thing is interesting. And I think that actually, and I will stop talking in a second, you are the guest, the people that actually want to hear from, is what I think we've both come to, and this is a thing I'd love for you to comment on, is, I believe we've both been pretty clear, is that hand tools are not the point. We both enjoy them for various reasons, but it's an ingredient in an approach, right? In fact, I know you've been thinking a lot lately about what the right mix of tools for you is. So anyway, that's a lot of thoughts to dump, but I wonder if you could comment on that, on how your thinking has evolved and is evolving towards like the set of tools that you use, and then maybe whether you have any concerns about that as far as the impact they might have on your thinking, like we were just talking about.
Yeah, no, those oh boy, there's
I know,
there's so many things I want to say now. I mean, it's an interesting point about the cost of the CNC machines. I didn't realize they were coming down that much. I will admit I have I feel for myself a certain aversion to those machines, um, mostly because I've worked my whole career programming
Yeah,
computers, and I turned to woodworking as a way to get a break from that.
yeah,
So the thought of bringing, and this might be a reason that I don't use computer aided design tools or drafting tools as well, right? Have spent just a huge amount of my life working with computers and getting frustrated when I can't get them to do what I want, and by drawing by hand and you know uh, and not using CNC machines, I like stop that from coming into my
I will
hobby.
jump in briefly and say you are not wrong. I was making some cornhole boards for a friend of mine. Wanted some these things made for. She has a youth charity. Anyway, it's just a board that I cut with my track saw. Love my track saw. I actually just did a video that I'll be posting soon on track saws. Just I think they're really awesome tools. And then I had to cut a hole in the thing in each of the boards, just a circle. And I could have done it with a jigsaw in not very long, but I'm like, I'll use the CNC router. And sure enough, it took 4 tries, and I had to ruin 2 test boards and go back and forth to the computer and tweak feed rates and tweak. And it is exactly what you are afraid of. Now, that's not like an indictment. It's still a useful tool, and I think for things like sign carving, for me, it's awesome, right? Like, because doing that by hand would be a pain in the butt to get good results anyway. But yes,
Yeah,
you absolutely are doing the thing you're talking about.
and obviously it's a totally different world for people who are making a living,
Of
or
course,
even a partial,
of
an
course,
additional income or whatever. That's a completely different thing. But so coming back to the question about my own thinking about tools, um, yeah, I have been thinking about this lately. So the other thing that I have been building, and I promise I'll loop this back, but the other thing that I've been building is a larger shop. And this has gone through a couple variants. My current shop is a space in my basement. Um, it's a little bit under 200 square feet. It's got my bandsaw and planer and my workbench and all my hand tools. Um, and it's been great as a to have that space to work in. And I've built a lot of stuff in there. But I've really been wanting a larger space. I've been wanting to get above ground to have natural light. Like it's I always struggle as the weather, when the weather's nice, to have to choose between time in the shop and time out of doors. So having a space that where I could open doors and windows and sort of feel more connected to the outside while I'm working would be great. Um, I also would really like the natural light, especially for finishing work. Uh, the lighting in my shop, not I could improve the lighting in the basement shop, but it's I like to be able to see how things look in natural sunlight. Um, so I had tentative plans to put an extension on the back of my garage for this purpose, and for a bunch of reasons, I live on a pretty small lot right in town. It's only a quarter acre, and like getting equipment in to do that work, that was it was going to be a lot, and it was going to really tear up the yard and everything, and the price was climbing. So I'm going to save the sort of dedicated shop space like that for some future property. But the plan now is to take over the bulk of the garage, which will be great. Um, it has 10-foot ceilings, and I'll be able to have plenty of windows, and it's all going to be good. Um, but in thinking about what the design of that is going to be, a big part of that question has been what would I put in there? Is it just to move the stuff out of the basement shop? And the answer is no. I am going to be getting some, for me, significant power equipment, and the the motivation for that is sort of, uh, well, there's a couple different ones. One is that I have substantial issues with my right shoulder. I'm right-handed, and I was in a quite bad car accident when I was uh, 12, 14, something like that, and my shoulder got really banged up, and it kind of loosened the ligaments there. And so as I've gotten older, like one of the ways my body has dealt with that injury from way back is for the muscles to really compensate for the looseness of the ligaments, which means the ligaments, as I understand it, basically uh, hold you in position when you're not moving, and then muscles would normally be the thing that causes you to move. And for me, the muscles do more of that work, and so the end result is I have a lot of issues just keeping my shoulder loose enough, and it increasingly relates to rotator cuff pain and things like that. Anyway, point being, working by hand, especially planing everything, like rough lumber prep planing, like is it puts a fair amount of strain on my shoulder, and so part of my motivation is moving towards tooling to help me do that step, just because I want to keep doing this for a long time, and I don't want to completely wear out my shoulder. Um, but another factor, and is so there's sort of that physicality piece, but another factor is just time. I mean, work is taken more of my time and energy in recent months, and I just don't have very much shop time, and so um, when I get in the shop, having to spend a big chunk of time working on like getting boards flat or the edges jointed square or what have you, it means progress is very slow, and it's not super satisfying. Um, I also, like, the last big furniture piece I did was a desk that I built for my mom, and the whole process, it was a project that I had going for like 20 months. Part of that was a whole bunch of issues came up in the middle, completely unrelated to that, that just slowed me down. So there were big periods where I wasn't working on it at all. But even if I just think about the actual number of hours worked, um, it was a lot, and I certainly don't begrudge my mom that. Right? It was, she asked me to build this desk for her, and it was made with love for sure.
It's beautiful,
Um,
by the way. If there's any way we can get a picture of it to throw up on the, maybe we'll talk about that otherwise.
yeah.
But it was a
Uh,
really lovely piece of work.
so I'm really happy that I did it, but you know, it construction wise, it's actually pretty simple. It's just a lot of parts, and it's really time consuming. So, uh, it's funny, right? I've talked a couple times. I've mentioned the sort of, you know, um, getting to the point where I wasn't intimidated by sort of the core joinery techniques, but then it kind of leads me to the question of, okay, but do I need to do all those by hand? So, for instance, I had that desk uses a frame and panel construction. There are inset panels on the backs and sides and inside the knee hole, and I think there's 12 of them all together, all rabbited on each side, and they all fit into raised framing that has grooves cut in it, and it's all plowed and rabbited by hands. Um, that could have been done, in far less time using other techniques. And I guess the sort of question I wonder about is, what am I getting from doing those things by hand, right? When I started working by hand, some of it was driven by budget and space, but also just a genuine interest in wanting to learn those techniques. But having learned them, I don't know, as there's a lot of benefit to me in terms of like, I'm going to plow every groove I ever make in a piece of furniture with a hand plane, right? I could, for sure. But does that make sense as a way to spend the time that I have in the shop, right? Or should I look at other approaches?
Sure.
But it is an interesting question, related to, I guess one of the other factors as an example. I was working with my child on building a dice rolling tray for role playing games, and I mentioned it to my twin brother who plays Dungeons and Dragons with a group of his friends, and he said, "Oh, that would be a cool Christmas gift for the people I play with. Do you think you could make a few more?" And it's funny, like it wouldn't take that long to do by hand, but it would, with the right power tools, it would have been done in an afternoon.
Sure.
And so I'm very conscious of the fact that there are things that people would like me potentially to build for them. Where saying, okay, but the way that I work, like this could take a month or more, doesn't, it's not as much of a commitment as I want to make to the thing. And it's not as long as they want to wait. And I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. But getting back to a point you made about, how does it affect what you do? I think or what is the right balance is a really interesting question, right? So my hope and my plan is that, like, when you work by hand, you learn several things about, techniques that you need to use to be successful. And one is that you gauge pieces off one another. You generally don't measure.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like where you're going to set a table saw fence to a certain distance and then run 5 pieces through it, right? You're going to make each piece to fit the task. And I think to fit the exact spot it needs to go in. And so my current thinking is that I would use machinery primarily to, get rough lumber into shape, but then I would, from there, would continue to work that way, right? So I'd still cut. I guess I just said, look, do I need to plow all these grooves by hand? And I'm about to say, I would still cut my joinery by hand. I don't know what the mix of those two will be.
Sure.
Like I don't ever expect I will use a dovetail jig, right? I expect I'll be making dovetails by hand the way I do now forever, because I don't like using routers a whole lot. Would I cut rabbets and grooves on a table saw? I don't know. I don't really like cutting dados on a table saw. So I'd probably still do those with a plane. I think I'll just find my way as I go.
Yeah, one of the things that you and I have talked about before is that for me, an explicit stated goal for me in my, making is about building capabilities. So it's not so much that, or it's not only that I'm taking up, metalworking and machining because I have particular things I want to make out of metal. It's that I want to be able to make things out of metal or wood or plastic or, you name it. And I think that's kind of where I've come to with the whole question of tools. Because, when I first got inspired by you to do more hand tool woodworking, I had previously used power tools exclusively. I had a table saw and all that good stuff. And I kind of swung the pendulum and went over. And as I've, come forward and become more experienced in my hobby, it really is about capabilities. And so like the advice I give to people is, you may not want to do edge joining with a hand plane, and that's fine. Like you prefer to use a power joiner. It's your favorite tool. That's great. Right. But you should know how to, because then you have a capability that you can exercise when the situation demands. So I think that's somewhere in what you're talking about a little bit is, and the capabilities have to do with your limitations too, right? Like I'm not as young as once I was. There will probably come a time when pushing a plane across a board, 700 times in an hour is beyond my capabilities. And at that point, it'll be good to have other capabilities, probably in the form of powered tools that let me do what it is I want to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree about. I guess I look at it. Hand tools are that's the tooling of the infinite, right?
Sure.
And so, uh, I've been encouraging. I've mentioned my nephews, right? I've been encouraging them to do more work with hand tools when it fits into what they're doing. Um, so they, kind of learn the power tool way first, and are learning more about hand tools as it's appropriate for the work that they do.
Hmm.
Um, I'm really happy, if I or as I start using some power tools for more things, that I went the other way, right? That I took the time to learn how to do these things by hand, because as you say, there's always a point where you might say, "Oh, this is beyond the capacity of the machine I have," or "I could do this on this machine, but it wouldn't be safe." Um,
Mm.
I recently had a conversation with an acquaintance as part of uh, a woodworking community I belong to, Shannon Rogers Hand Tool School, and um, I actually don't know. My suspicion is that he started more as a power tool woodworker, and then really picked up hand tools. And I asked him about project by project or step of a project, like how he decides what to do. And one of his points, he had several, but one of his points was, well, when something's too small to safely do with a table saw or joiner, I do it by hand. Um, or if something's new to me, so there's something to learn from doing it, I do it by hand. Um, or value, right? I'm working on a thing where, like, I'm going to build a thing that I'm going to give to someone, and there's meaning in the fact that I did this work by hand.
Mm.
And I thought those were interesting dimensions to think about. Um, just like it's funny to say, I don't have many cabinets in my shop because the fast way to build cabinets is with plywood and pocket screws or dominoes or whatever.
Yep.
And it's not tooling that I have, or it's not work that I'm set up to do. And, you know, it's kind of goofy to say like, well, I'd really like to have cabinets in my shop, but I'm gonna have to build them the way they did in the 1700s.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I can see making that shift, and as you say, gain the capabilities to do both things.
Yeah. God, that's good stuff. It's funny. I had in my mind that, this time around I'll ask Tim, what are you making? And then we'll talk about that. And then I'll ask Tim, what are you learning? And we'll talk about that. But just like every single other show that I've done so far, it turns out that those two things are inextricably linked in every conversation I've had. So we've just spent a lot of time talking about, making things, but we've also spent a lot of time talking about, and this goes back to your really excellent conference talk about, like, thinking about that, like what it does to your brain about learning and whatnot. So I just find that endlessly fascinating, the intersection of those two things. Um, that said, I would like to ask you before we, get to an hour and a half here, which we could easily do, and I would be enthralled the whole time. But I will ask you the question. We can maybe pivot, and Tim, what are you learning?
Um, well, I mean, I've been. I guess it is very closely related,
Sure.
right? So, I mean, I talked about working on this mirror project and learning how to make something that has a substantially curved aspect to
Mm-hmm.
it. So I've been trying for a while to include curves in everything that I do, but they tend to be very, minor decorative things on an otherwise straight piece. Where this one is like, here's actual joinery and decoration that has to follow the curve. And so just learning those techniques. Um, so certainly that, I would say, has I've been challenging myself there and making progress.
Do, do you have like a way that, so when you said to yourself, I want to learn how to, I want to get better at making curves, do you have an approach to learning where you're like, okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is, I don't know, like for me, I would look for a book. That's one of the things I look for. Do you have a approach that you use for stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly lately for I would turn to a book too. A lot of what I learned about hand tool woodworking probably it's a mix of books and YouTube. Um, and this is a place like I absolutely love the Hayward
Mhm.
uh, volumes that Lost Art Press put out because uh, he wrote all kinds of pieces or edited all kinds of pieces about how to do more complex hand tool work than there's a lot of books that are like here's the basics of making a table or making a drawer, um, but he would cover like how to cut stopped grooves by hand efficiently, how to work a rabbit around a curve, how to work a molding around a convex corner, but have it be rounded, right? So um, I find his books or his articles just an endless source of information and also challenges. I mean, part of why I took this on was I found the article, which is uh, this is how you cut a curve around a rabbit, rather around a curve. And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. I have to try that. I'll need to come up with a project that requires me to do that, so
Yeah.
I can so I can learn um, the steps that he's taking. And one of the interesting takeaways from that is, a lot of time when you're doing joinery and you need something larger, like think about chopping out a half blind dovetail. Like a lot of people argue to excavate the back of the dovetail so that you can then cut in from the side and break off big chunks. And in a way, his approach to cutting a curved rabbit um, takes that approach, but it's starts or one of the early steps is taking a narrow gouge and trenching along the curve of the rabbit, and that leaves waste on the outside that you can then easily remove with a chisel. Um, and so it's just interesting. Like there was a essentially, in addition to carving gouges, what are called firmer gouges or bench gouges, which are heavier weight gouges that were used for primarily for heavier stock removal. But the interesting thing about using a gouge is because of the shape, you're not going to split out the grain. Like if you tried to dig that trench with a chisel, your chance of um, breaking the shoulder of the curve as you went around it would be a lot higher. So, like, I think that that's actually a thing I've been reflecting on is the role of the gouge as a joinery tool, not
Hmm.
just as a carving tool.
That's really interesting. And I realize that we've been throwing around a lot of technical terms. Rabbet for one, which is rebate to the British, which is just like an L-shaped excavation in the edge of a piece of wood. A gouge, just for people, real briefly, is just a curved chisel, really. Anyway, sorry about that. I think your points were all super interesting, even independent of the technical stuff. I just need to remind myself every once in a while to drop a comment because we're going to have people coming to this podcast, I hope, from all sorts of disciplines, metalworking, or maybe just people interested in learning. Anyway, but sorry, I didn't mean to distract from your point, which is
No, no
super
worries. So
interesting.
the other thing I've been learning, well, I mean, working on the design for the shop, I've been
Mm,
learning a lot about various tool options that are out there for various things, and thinking through like there too capabilities, right? What would I want to use different tools to do? Um, how do I expect them to fit into my workflow?
oh man, that's
Thinking
like
about
one of
what
my
it takes to
hobbies is
design a
like,
shop.
sorry, you're describing, I could almost argue that one of my hobbies is looking at tools.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, working on the design for a shop, right? Just having to worry about lighting and power requirements, and um, it's stuff that like I did sort of piecemeal in my current shop, but I'm trying to take a more holistic approach to this one. Um, I think the other thing, and this is going to go kind of in a different direction, is I had a significant health issue last year, and that I was diagnosed with cancer. Thankfully, I'm now cancer
Yes,
free.
thankfully.
Um, but I had stage 3 cancer, and like I'm not one to dwell on my own mortality, but I will admit you kind of feel the breeze as that goes by.
I mean, honestly, I gotta say, Tim, I don't know if I've said this to you. I would have fallen apart. Like I was so impressed by your ability to get through that with, I mean, I'm sure it was incredibly stressful, but like you seem to deal with it and we're close, right? Like I feel like I had some insight into what was going on with you, and it would have rocked me completely off my feet. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. A number of people have said that to me, and I think there's two reasons. I've explained to a number of folks like a big part of that was the uh, as scary as it might be to be diagnosed with cancer, the prognosis was always quite good.
Mm,
And so I think my reaction would have been quite different if the prognosis had not been good.
mm,
um, but I think the other thing is, that has to do with how I grew up, and I'm going to credit my grandfather, right? Like, it's a problem. Uh, you would hope to not be in that situation, but if you are in that situation, you get on with it. You do the things you have to do. Um, you know, Waving your hands in the air and wailing about it isn't going to make a difference. So, um, that might sound harsh, right? I don't mean
no,
it to come across
I
that way.
believe I
Like,
take it the way you mean
people
it.
have
Yeah,
their, people have different reactions, and their obviously, they're all totally valid. I don't mean to, you know, suggest that people who react otherwise are somehow
sure.
incorrect. But for me, I was raised that, like, hey, here's a thing, we have to try to overcome it by taking these steps. So you take the steps you need to take, and hopefully that works. And for me, it did. So that's good.
Yeah,
Um, but the thing that why do I bring it up here, right? I think it has made me reflect a lot on, you know, okay, what time do I have, and what do I want to do with it, and what is the purpose of my woodworking, right? Uh, I got into woodworking because I wanted to make things that would last beyond my lifetime. I work in software. We both work in software, and um, there's precious few things you do today in software that are going to be around in 5 years or
yeah,
10 years,
yeah,
let alone 50 years.
yeah. In fact, we
So
both had the amusing experience of having worked together to replace an old piece of software, and then a mere 15 years later, hearing people complain about it as this old, decrepit thing that now needs to be replaced.
yeah, but 15 years these days in software, that's a good
It was
run,
a
man.
pretty good run for sure, but it's still funny to think about.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm very conscious of now is, you know, especially as I have less time to work in the shop, is like, okay, how much time do I have to make things? And I have a big list of things I want to make. And the funny thing about it is, many of them are things I don't actually really need.
Mm,
So for whatever reason, since the first time I saw, there's a style of furniture, it's a Southern vernacular style called a hunt board. Um, and you can think of it as a variation on what would be called a sideboard, like in a dining room for keeping dishes and serving on and what have you. And I don't know, there's something about that form that is very appealing to me. And so I really want to make one. And I like making bigger case pieces. They feel like puzzles to me. I like the intricacy of all the parts, like the desk that I built for my mom. I've lost track, but I mean, I want to say it had 150 parts. Um, I just think that it's you know I'm not going to say it's like a puzzle, because how the pieces go together, but it's an interesting thing to make. And um, so it's an odd thing. Like, I was sort of joking with my wife, saying, I'm going to spend this money to build the shop in the garage, and get the tools that I want, so that I can build furniture that I don't really need. But the but the thing I do need is to build.
hmm
So I'm not actually sure what precisely I would build, or what I'll do with things, the things that I build. But it is very important to me to be building, and as my role in our company becomes is less directly involved in the technical details. I don't know. Building with furniture kind of fills a gap for me.
Totally.
And after my experience last year, I am very conscious of, like, I loved building the desk for my mom, but I don't want every project to take 12 to 18
Sure.
months to complete, because then I'm not going to complete as many as I would like.
Sure. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yep.
Yeah, for me it's the lathe, by the way. I don't have infinite pieces of furniture lying around, but I'm sitting at my desk right now looking at 3 bowls that I made.
I was going to say, you have stacks of bowls all over the place.
It's not quite to stacks yet, but it is. And the thing, of course, with the lathe is, whereas a piece of furniture for me, like you, is weeks or months from start to finish. A bowl is minutes or hours, so you can wind up with a lot more. But it's so fun, and I really enjoyed it, and I will keep making bowls, even if we get to the point where every single piece of dinnerware we eat off of in an entire month is made of wood and came from my hands. I'll still make more.
Yeah, exactly. It's that, I don't know. It's whatever the drive is. I just want to create things.
Yeah.
And one of the things I hope to do in this new shop space, like at the moment, my lathe is already up in the garage, and I don't really use it very often. But I'm hoping to have it more incorporated into my work.
Well, they're good at curves.
Yeah, for sure.
They're not really good at anything else, in fact. Cool. So this is awesome, and I don't want to cut you off. If there's more that you would like to share with our audience about, making or learning, that's certainly, we have time for that. But it might not be a bad idea to sort of, transition to our last question, and of course we'll have you back on. I mean, you and I talk basically every day, and we often talk on weekends, and we often get to 4:30 on a Friday and say, you know what, like, no more work is going to happen. My brain is tired. Hey, Tim, let's talk about what you're going to build this weekend. Anyway, point being, if there's anything else you'd like to cover, awesome. And if not, we will turn to our final question.
Yeah, let's go to the final question.
Cool. So that is, of course, to ask you for a piece of advice. It can be advice about anything. It does not have to be about getting smarter or making stuff. Although we would certainly appreciate advice in that arena. You've already given us a bunch to think about, but maybe we can ask you for one more.
Yeah. Wow. I knew about the first two questions when it came on. I mean, this is sort of where I've been spending a lot of time lately. Is really kind of digging into, why you work the way you work, like why you choose to do what you do. And I mean, this is just sort of where I'm at the moment, because I've been thinking a lot about that, with like, why did I choose to work by hand? Why do I, there's a part of me that's like, oh man, start using machines for stuff. I don't know. In some ways, like I have moments of like, am I letting myself down? Like I had this goal to do this by hand, and I've
it's okay,
met a lot of people who are like, I know it is, right. I understand that. But it is that reflection of like, why do I like to work by hands? And, look, I'm not, I'm not a historical reenactor. There's a guy, Zach Dillinger, who has said that his goal is to create pieces of furniture that confuse historians about their provenance. He wants to build things now that they look at and go, basically, if we didn't carbon date it, we would think this was from, the 1700s, which, hey, that's great. Like, that's his goal. Lately it has been on my mind, right, about why I choose to do the things that I do, and what my real goal is, and to recognize that it's okay for it to change over time. Like, I acknowledge that there was a part of my path that was like, I think it's really cool to do this work by hand, and I want to learn those skills, and I take pride in the fact that I taught myself those skills. But building things, especially, building things like this desk for my mom, or the easel I made for my wife, or, the dice tray I was working on with my child. It's way more important for me that I'm creating those artifacts to share with them. And sometimes they're participating in creating them. That's way more important to me than I did it a particular way. So I don't know. I mean, that may not be I don't know if that's advice exactly, but that's kind of where my head's at.
No, it is, because it's something to think on. And I think that is easily interpreted as advice. Certainly. I mean, you and I have had, anyway, we could easily go on for another entire show about exactly this topic, but I think we'll close it down there. I will thank you for the advice and for all of the other super interesting information, despite the fact that I've talked with you, as I said, something approaching 9,000 times about this stuff. I still find your insights to be endlessly fascinating, and I think our listeners will feel the same. So thanks a ton for taking the time to come on and talk with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. Hopefully it's useful to somebody, and I appreciate your asking me.
All right, cool. Well, we'll close it down there. This has been Get Smarter and Make Stuff. listening to Get Smarter and Make Stuff. I'm your host, Craig Andera. Visit the show online at getsmarterandmakestuff.com. That's all spelled out, all one word. Go there to subscribe to and comment on the show, read the blog, view the gallery, and find a link to the Get Smarter and Make Stuff YouTube channel. Come on by. We're also on Twitter at Make Smart Stuff. If you enjoyed the show and feel like sharing with others you think might like it too, I'd certainly appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.